In the latest chapter of the Trump administration's intensified immigration enforcement campaign, a new front has emerged in the form of faceless officers masked immigration and customs enforcement, ICE, agents, operating in unmarked vehicles. The secrecy surrounding their identity, equipment, and procedures has triggered alarm among civil rights groups, immigration attorneys, and members of Congress. In a detailed letter sent to Department of Homeland Security, DHS, Secretary Kristi Noem, Representatives Robert Garcia and Summer Lee demanded clarity, transparency, and accountability regarding these operations. This article explores the legal, ethical, and constitutional implications of ICE's masked enforcement activities, situates the controversy within the broader context of Trump-era immigration policy, and considers the challenges ahead for lawmakers and immigrant communities. The letter that sparked the national debate, the catalyst for national attention, was a letter authored by Rep. Robert Garcia, a leading Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, and Rep. Summer Lee. Their letter, made public through The Guardian, demanded that DHS release internal documents, memos, directives, emails, guidance pertaining to the agency's authorization of masked operations and the use of unmarked cars. The two lawmakers framed their appeal around the U.S. Constitution's Fourth and Fifth Amendments, asserting that ICE's tactics are in direct violation of guarantees against unreasonable searches and seizures and the right to due process. These tactics contradict long-standing democratic principles such as the public's right to accountability from those who enforce the law, they wrote. This bold legislative intervention marked a turning point in what had been largely an administrative and legal debate, the rise of the masked officer. Historically, ICE agents have operated with a level of anonymity not typically associated with local or state police. But under the Trump administration, the use of masks, particularly ski masks and balaclavas, and the deployment of unmarked vehicles for arrests, detentions, and raids have escalated sharply. While ICE claims the masks are used to protect agent safety in an increasingly hostile public environment, critics argue they create a climate of fear, enable potential abuse, and erode trust in law enforcement. The public outcry has intensified in the wake of viral videos showing agents dragging immigrants into vans without clear identification. Public trust and constitutional crisis. The use of masks and anonymous tactics goes far beyond optics. It touches at the heart of constitutional governance. The Fourth Amendment ensures protection from unreasonable search and seizure, while the Fifth guarantees due process. Without visible identification, legal redress becomes murky. Victims cannot name their detainers. Courts cannot verify procedural legitimacy. This is particularly significant in immigration enforcement, where many detainees do not have legal representation, are unaware of their rights, or are too afraid to report abuse. The specter of masked agents sends a chilling message. You can be arrested without knowing by whom or why. Real-world consequences and criminal impersonation. The danger is not just theoretical. Garcia and Lee cited multiple disturbing incidents. In one case in Florida, a woman donned an ICE T-shirt and kidnapped her ex-boyfriend's wife, threatening her until she escaped. In California, teenagers impersonated ICE agents, showed fake badges, and robbed Hispanic individuals. These are not outliers. When the public cannot distinguish between legitimate officers and impersonators, the door opens to exploitation, fraud, and abuse. Masked ICE agents are effectively providing a blueprint for criminal opportunists. Judicial secrecy and institutional complicity, perhaps even more troubling, is the pattern of concealment extending into the judicial system. The Intercept reported on immigration judges in New York who allowed government attorneys to remain anonymous during deportation proceedings. This undermines the principle of open courtrooms, and the accused right to confront their accuser, a cornerstone of American jurisprudence. Such secrecy creates a Kafkaesque environment where immigrants face invisible prosecutors and masked arresting officers, stripping due process to its bones. Legislative pushback at state and federal levels. Democratic lawmakers have responded with a multi-pronged legislative strategy. Senators Cory Booker and Alex Padilla introduced a federal bill requiring ICE officers to display clearly legible identification during operations. A similar measure was introduced in the House. At the state level, legislation mandating visible identification for federal officers is gaining traction in California, New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. While these laws may face preemption challenges, they signal growing resistance to ICE's anonymity and a desire to restore transparency in law enforcement. DHS and ICE's defense. Agent safety and rising threats. ICE and DHS officials have defended their practices on the grounds of officer safety. Todd Lyons, head of ICE, told reporters that masks are a tool to protect agents and their families from harassment, threats, and doxing. There is some validity to this claim. The last few years have seen a surge in anti-ICE protests, threats against agents, and online exposure campaigns. In that climate, concealing identities can be seen as a protective measure, but does that justify wholesale secrecy? Critics argue that the need for safety must be balanced against constitutional rights and public accountability. Local police officers who face similar dangers are still required to wear badges, name tags, and uniforms. Impact on immigrant communities. For immigrants, especially undocumented ones, these masked operations are more than a legal or political issue. They are an existential threat. Advocacy organizations report that fear of ICE has caused immigrants to avoid hospitals, schools, and even church services. Masked arrests, conducted in early morning hours by unidentified men in black tactical gear, resemble abductions more than arrests. For vulnerable communities already traumatized by raids and deportations, the psychological toll is profound. International human rights standards and U.S. obligations. The United States is a signatory to numerous international treaties and covenants that guarantee due process, protection from arbitrary detention, and the right to legal redress. The anonymity of ICE operations places the U.S. at odds with these commitments. The United Nations Human Rights Council has previously criticized similar tactics in other countries, calling them hallmarks of authoritarian policing. If the U.S. allows masked officers and secret arrests to become the norm, it risks joining the ranks of nations it has long chastised for similar behavior. What comes next? With Trump's immigration crackdown escalating and a $45 billion DHS budget now approved, the practice of masked enforcement will likely grow. This raises critical questions for civil liberties, public safety, and the rule of law. Will Democratic lawmakers succeed in passing their transparency bills? Will DHS face legal challenges for these practices? Will the courts intervene? And most importantly, how long can constitutional democracy survive when law enforcement officers are allowed to operate in secrecy? The history of masked law enforcement in America. Masked law enforcement agents are not a new phenomenon in U.S. history. During the Prohibition era, federal agents would sometimes operate in anonymity to avoid retaliation from organized crime syndicates. However, these were rare exceptions, often tied to covert surveillance or undercover operations, not standard enforcement practices. What sets the current ICE practices apart is their routine nature. The systematic use of masks during community-level arrests, often of nonviolent individuals, has no recent precedent. In fact, even in counterterrorism operations conducted by the FBI or DEA, officers are typically required to identify themselves unless undercover. The normalization of masked officers represents a dramatic departure from the traditional norms of democratic policing and raises fundamental concerns about accountability and abuse. The role of media in uncovering the masked ICE narrative. Investigative journalism has played a pivotal role in bringing this issue to light. Outlets like The Guardian, The Intercept, and ProPublica have documented and verified incidents through video footage, court records, and eyewitness testimony. These reports, often accompanied by chilling visuals of anonymous men dragging individuals into vans, have spurred public outrage. In an era of misinformation and state secrecy, these media outlets have become the de facto watchdogs of civil liberties. Their work pressures lawmakers to act and empowers communities to resist unlawful enforcement tactics. Without the media's role, the masked ICE narrative could have remained a silent threat, one that unfolded in the shadows, far from public scrutiny. Whistleblowers within ICE and DHS? Several current and former ICE agents have spoken anonymously to reporters and human rights organizations about internal discomfort with these enforcement methods. Some agents describe feeling like paramilitary operatives rather than law enforcement officers. Others express fear of being involved in actions that could eventually face legal or constitutional challenge. One former ICE supervisor told a journalist under condition of anonymity, "We joined to enforce immigration law, not to become secret police. This is not what we signed up for." These internal warnings underscore a critical point. Even within ICE, there are deep concerns that the current trajectory is unsustainable and potentially illegal. Comparison with other federal agencies, FBI, Delaware A, etc. The FBI and DEA both conduct high-risk operations involving dangerous individuals, yet they have strict protocols regarding identification. Agents typically wear clear markings, and in court documents or testimony, their identities are traceable. Why, then, has ICE deviated from this model? The answer may lie in the nature of their targets. Unlike drug traffickers or terrorist suspects, most ICE arrestees are undocumented immigrants, many of whom have no criminal records and pose no physical threat. This makes the militarized, masked approach appear not only excessive, but also designed to intimidate rather than protect. The Trump administration's broader immigration strategy, the masked ICE controversy, cannot be separated from the larger strategy of the Trump administration. Since taking office, Trump has prioritized deportations, border wall construction, visa restrictions, and family separation. The administration's messaging has consistently framed undocumented immigrants as threats to public safety regardless of criminal history. By painting immigration enforcement as a battlefront, it has justified increasingly militarized tactics, including the use of masks and secrecy. The goal is deterrence, but the cost may be irreparable damage to civil liberties. Legal battles ahead. A constitutional showdown? Civil rights organizations like the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the National Immigration Law Center are preparing to challenge ICE's practices in court. Potential lawsuits may argue that masked arrests violate constitutional protections under the 4th, 5th, and even 14th Amendments. Already, local courts in sanctuary cities have begun questioning the legality of ICE arrests conducted without proper identification. If a federal court were to rule against the agency, it could reshape the parameters of immigration enforcement nationwide. The stakes are enormous. At the heart of the legal battle is this question: can a democracy allow its agents to operate in complete anonymity? Interviews with former ICE agents and experts, Dr. Maria Elena Gonzalez, a former DHS legal advisor, told a university panel, "Anonymity in law enforcement should be the exception, not the rule. When agents hide their faces, they erase the chain of accountability." Retired ICE agent David Cruz, who served under both Republican and Democratic administrations, stated, We used to focus on the mission tracking down dangerous criminals. Now it feels like political theater. The masks, that's about optics, not safety. Their testimony paints a picture of an agency under strain, not just from external scrutiny, but internal identity crisis. Stories from the ground. Testimonies of the arrested. Among the most compelling critiques of masked enforcement come from those who've experienced it firsthand. Rumeysa Öztürk, a doctoral student at Tufts University, was arrested by masked ICE agents outside her apartment. A video shows her confused and asking repeatedly who was arresting her. The agents refused to answer. "I thought I was being kidnapped," she said later. "It was like something out of a nightmare." In another case, a 6-year-old in California witnessed his father pulled into a van by unmarked agents. The boy thought it was a gang kidnapping and called 911. These stories highlight the psychological trauma and community panic caused by these tactics. They are not isolated incidents. They are representative of a systemic approach. How local governments are responding? Several cities and counties have pushed back. New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles have enacted local ordinances prohibiting cooperation with ICE unless agents present court-issued warrants and official identification. Police departments in these jurisdictions have begun advising residents on how to verify the legitimacy of ICE operations. Some have even issued Know Your Rights cards in multiple languages. The message from local leaders is clear. If the federal government will not protect constitutional rights, municipalities will. The road to reform. What would transparent immigration enforcement look like? What might a more accountable immigration enforcement system look like? Reform advocate propose mandatory visible ID for all ICE agents. Use of body cameras during all arrest operations. Publicly accessible documentation for every operation. Legal representation for all detainees within 24 hours. Independent civilian oversight boards for ICE actions. These are not radical proposals. They mirror the standards applied to police departments across the country. If ICE is to regain public trust, it must accept the same level of scrutiny. Conclusion: a nation at a crossroads. The issue of masked ICE agents is more than a tactical concern. It is a symbol of a larger battle over the identity of American democracy. Will we be a nation where law is enforced in the shadows, or a nation where accountability, transparency, and human rights remain guiding principles? As the Trump administration expands immigration operations with unprecedented funding and force, the answer may define the moral compass of the United States for decades to come. Garcia and Lee's letter was not just a procedural request. It was a warning cry that when power operates without a face, democracy loses its soul.